The mystery of Amityville began with a crime that shocked the nation. On the night of November 13, 1974, 6 members of the DeFeo family, a father, a mother, and 4 children, were brutally murdered inside their home. At the center of it all was their son, Ronald Butch DeFeo Jr., accused of carrying out the killings. Butch confessed, yet his story changed time and time again, leaving investigators with more questions than answers. This is part 2 of the Amityville case, where the story shifts from the horrific murders to the courtroom battles, the unanswered questions, and the controversies that would haunt this case long after the trial ended. Welcome to Crime Aura, where the darkest true crime stories come to life. We bring you gripping stories every week, so make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications to stay in the loop. Now, let's dive into today's story. From the very beginning, questions were raised about how police handled Ronald Butch DeFeo Jr. His first lawyer, Leonard Simmons, claimed his client may have been mistreated during questioning. At the time, Suffolk County Police already had a reputation. Their confession rates were unusually high, and critics argued that officers often pushed suspects too far. Reporters covering the case noted that accusations of police brutality were common, and later investigations into the department's methods would reveal troubling patterns. To many, it seemed the police wanted the case wrapped up quickly. A fast confession meant an open and shut trial. Meanwhile, Butch's legal defense was in disarray. Simmons stepped down after only a few days. His replacement, Lester Lipkin, lasted just weeks. All the while, the DeFeo estate loomed over the proceedings. With no will left behind, the estate was headed to probate court, something that worried the grandfathers, Rocco and Mike Brigante. If Butch was acquitted, he stood to inherit everything. They did not want to wait through years of trials and appeals. Mike Brigante devised a plan. He persuaded Butch to sign away his rights to the estate, promising stronger legal help in return. He delivered, bringing in Jacob Siegfried, a skilled attorney known for his sharp legal instincts. On the other side, the prosecution was taking shape. Young Deputy District Attorney Gerard Sullivan had pushed for months to get the case, and when he finally did, his approach was unusual. Sullivan believed the murders should be treated as a Manson-style crime, suggesting that more than one killer was involved. He even built a task force around that theory. The idea caused friction. Some detectives supported him, others did not. Butch himself had hinted early on that he hadn't acted alone, and soon attention turned to people within his circle. His girlfriend, Geraldine, drew early whispers, with speculation that she might have known more than she admitted. Then came another name, Bobby Kelsky, one of Butch's closest friends. But Butch pointed the finger elsewhere, toward his sister, Dawn. He claimed she helped keep the younger children in their rooms during the shootings. Evidence suggested Dawn may have been awake at the time. Traces of burned gunpowder were found on her nightgown. Yet photographs showed her body tucked neatly under a blanket. Her autopsy revealed she had not been shot at close range. The absence of stippling around her wound suggested the shot came from some distance. If she had been under the blanket when killed, the gunpowder should have settled on the fabric, not her clothing. The autopsy raised another mystery. Examinations began nearly 36 hours after the estimated time of death. By then, all the other victims were in full rigor mortis. Dawn's body, however, was only in partial rigor. Unusual, since rigor typically fades after 24 to 36 hours. The difference suggested she may have died later than the rest of the family, possibly hours afterward. From the start, the DeFeo case was riddled with contradictions, unstable legal teams, conflicting evidence, and competing theories. And still, one haunting question remained. What really happened inside the DeFeo home that night? By 1975, the case was moving slowly. Butch's lawyer, Siegfried, told him his best chance was to plead insanity. Butch exploded with anger. He made threats and even tried to attack his own attorney. The situation became impossible, and Siegfried resigned just 4 months before the trial. Once again, Butch was left without legal representation. The trial would be overseen by Judge Ernest Signorelli of the Suffolk Supreme Court. Faced with the problem of Butch having no defense, Signorelli reached out to a trusted colleague, attorney William Weber. For Weber, the DeFeo case was more than just another job. It was an opportunity to build his reputation. In July 1975, he accepted the role and stepped into the spotlight, ready to lead the defense of Butch DeFeo. When William Weber took over the case, he was immediately faced with a serious problem. The defense had no access to key evidence, no lab reports, no crime scene photographs, and very little paperwork needed to prepare for trial. These materials had been withheld by the previous judge. Weber quickly filed motions to obtain them. Judge Signorelli agreed. He ordered that all police reports, crime scene photos, and lab records be released to the defense. He also approved county funding so Weber could hire a private investigator. But this decision caused friction. Prosecutors were unhappy with Signorelli's ruling, especially since Weber had once helped with the judge's campaign for surrogate court. Attorney Gerard Sullivan, in particular, pushed back. He pressed for Signorelli to be removed from the case, pointing to old disagreements and professional conflicts. Under growing pressure, Judge Signorelli stepped aside, and the case was reassigned to Justice Thomas Michael Stark in the summer of 1975. Michael Brigante recommended a seasoned investigator named Herman Race. Weber quickly brought Herman Race onto the case. His mission was daunting: to dig into the details and uncover what truly happened on the night of the DeFeo murders. Herman Race began his own review, speaking with witnesses and carefully studying the evidence. What he found raised serious questions about the prosecution's version of events. One discovery stood out. Gunpowder particles were found on Dawn DeFeo's nightgown. The only explanation was clear. Dawn herself may have fired a gun that night. This was a turning point. Herman Race and William, their aim was twofold: challenge the claim that Butch DeFeo acted alone, while also preparing a case that could support an insanity plea. At a preliminary hearing, Weber tried to have Butch's confession thrown out, arguing it had been forced through police brutality. He called witnesses who testified that police had blocked him from seeing Butch during questioning. Weber claimed detectives had beaten his client and that the confession and everything tied to it, including the murder weapon, should not be allowed in court. In the end, Judge Stark ruled there was no proof that police had abused DeFeo, and the confession would stay in evidence. For the defense, it was a crushing setback. Without removing that confession, the prosecution's case became much stronger. On October 6, 1975, the trial of Butch DeFeo began. A jury was selected from ordinary citizens, men and women of different ages and backgrounds. Young adults, middle-aged workers, and senior citizens all took their seats, united by one heavy duty: to decide the fate of Ronald Butch DeFeo Jr. The prosecution laid out its case in detail. One claim stood out. They argued that after killing his father, Butch placed the body back into bed, where police later discovered it. But this version left an unsettling question. At only 165 pounds, Butch was far smaller than his father, who weighed nearly 270 pounds. Could he really have lifted and repositioned such a heavy body alone? The possibility that someone else was involved, that another hand helped move the body, has never been fully ruled out. By the midpoint of the trial, the defense found themselves backed into a corner. The evidence against Butch was mounting, and their options for a successful strategy were quickly running out. With little else to hold on to, they leaned heavily on a single approach, portraying him not solely as the perpetrator of violence, but also as one of its victims. In their telling, Butch was shaped by years of hardship and abuse. The defense team, led by attorney William Weber, painted a portrait of a young man shaped by years of turmoil within his own home. They described a household where anger, criticism, and emotional abuse flowed freely, with the father at the center of much of it. Weber argued that such a toxic environment would eventually push anyone to their limits. To him, he was not simply a killer, but also a casualty of his father's cruelty, a broken soul pushed past the point of no return. The prosecution team, however, rejected this view entirely. They insisted the evidence told a very different story, one of intent, calculation, and control. Forensic reports revealed details of a crime carried out with precision. The murders were followed by an attempt to clean the scene, and investigators noted how Butch had already begun spreading the story of a mob hit to explain what had happened. These steps, the prosecution argued, pointed to a man who was fully aware of his actions and determined to cover them up. In their eyes, the motive was clear. As the eldest son of the DeFeo family, Butch had lived for years under his father's strict and domineering rule. By eliminating his parents, prosecutors suggested he sought not only freedom from that control, but also a path to financial independence. Rumors swirled of a hidden sum of $200,000 within the house, a fortune that could provide a clean slate and a new beginning. But to reach that fresh start, prosecutors believed, Butch made a chilling calculation. His siblings, young and innocent, would stand in the way. In his mind, they were potential witnesses, and so they too were marked for death. The story, as framed by both sides, became a struggle between two competing narratives. One of a damaged young man who finally broke under years of abuse, and another of a cold, deliberate killer who murdered his entire family to free himself and secure a fortune. With public opinion against his client and little chance of winning, William Weber knew he needed another approach. He turned to an insanity defense, hoping it might be the only way to save Butch from spending the rest of his life in prison. At first, Weber considered using insanity to explain why Butch had never been drafted into the Vietnam War. But that plan quickly collapsed when one of Butch's aunt took the stand. She gave a very different explanation. She testified that Butch's father had paid a military recruiter $5,000 to keep his son from being drafted. It was a damaging moment. The defense struggled to paint Butch as unstable. Friends and acquaintances described him, but their words did not create the picture of a man lost to madness. Attorney Weber still clung to the insanity defense. If Butch could convince the jury he was mentally unwell, he might avoid a prison sentence and instead be sent to a psychiatric facility. But everything depended on his performance in the courtroom. When Butch DeFeo finally took the stand, he gave a chilling account of the night his family was murdered. He told the jury that a shadowy figure appeared before him, holding a rifle. Its hands, he said, were black. At that moment, he believed the figure was his sister, Dawn. He claimed she had often spoken of killing their parents, believing it was the only way to escape to Florida with her boyfriend. DeFeo went further. He insisted he heard voices, sometimes whispering his name when no one else was around. He said he believed it was God speaking to him. And then, the story grew even stranger. After handing him the rifle, DeFeo claimed the figure with black hands vanished into thin air. Prosecutor Gerard Sullivan challenged him at every step. He accused DeFeo of twisting the truth, blaming Dawn because she was no longer alive to defend herself. Sullivan reminded the jury that Dawn had been shot with the same rifle, making it impossible for her to have carried out the murders of her brothers and sisters. Under cross-examination, Butch's carefully constructed story began to fall apart. The more questions he faced, the weaker his answers became. Finally, he admitted that once he fired the first shot, he couldn't stop. Once I started, I couldn't stop. It was like something inside moving me. Butch confessed to killing every member of his family. When Butch's testimony finally came to an end, the fate of the trial shifted into the hands of the jury. Their task was not an easy one. For several days, they carefully weighed the arguments laid out by both the defense and the prosecution. But in the end, their decision was firm. They concluded that Butch DeFeo Jr. had not been insane at the time of the murders. He was found guilty on all 6 counts of first-degree murder. On December 4, 1975, the court delivered its sentence, 6 concurrent terms of 25 years to life without the possibility of parole. With the decision finalized, Butch was quietly escorted out of the courtroom and transferred to Greenhaven Correctional Facility in Stormville, New York. There, he would begin serving what amounted to a lifetime behind bars. After Butch's trial and conviction, the people of Amityville hoped the nightmare had finally ended. But in truth, the story was only the beginning. In 1965, the DeFeo family moved into 112 Ocean Avenue, where they would live for the next 9 years, until tragedy struck a length. Just 1 year after the DeFeo murders, the house went back on the market. Despite its dark history, it still drew the attention of a young couple searching for a fresh start. George and Kathleen Lutz were beginning a new chapter of their lives. George, 28, was a former Marine working in his family's land surveying business. Kathy, 30, was a mother of three: Daniel, age 10, Christopher, 7, and little Melissa, just 5 years old. Their budget was tight, but their real estate agent insisted on showing them the Dutch Colonial on Ocean Avenue. From the moment they arrived, the house stood out. It wasn't just another listing. It was waterfront property in one of the area's most prestigious neighborhoods. It offered far more than they had dreamed possible. Only after their enthusiasm was clear did the broker share the home's dark past. The Lutzes talked it over. They viewed it as a tragedy, but not a reason to turn away. The discounted price reflected its history, and they didn't see themselves as superstitious people. The sign that read "High Hopes" on the front lawn captured what George and Kathy felt at the time. They believed the house could be the foundation for a new life, filled with the hopes they carried into their marriage. On December 18, 1975, just 13 months after the murders, George and Kathy Lutz moved into 112 Ocean Avenue with Kathy's 3 children and the family dog. But before they settled in, George received a word of caution. A friend urged him to have it blessed. George, though Methodist, turned to the only priest he knew, Father Ralph Pecoraro, who would come to be known as Father Ray. On moving day, Father Ray arrived to bless the house. He moved room to room, sprinkling holy water, reciting prayers. When he entered the sewing room, something felt wrong. Despite the bright winter afternoon outside, the room was unnaturally cold. As he prayed, he later recalled hearing a harsh, commanding voice behind him. "Get out." At that same instant, he felt a sharp slap across his face, though no one else was in the room. Father Ray finished quickly and quietly advised the Lutzes not to spend much time in that space. For the Lutz family, Christmas of 1975 should have been a season of joy, a time to celebrate in their new home. But almost immediately, little things began to stand out. Strange noises at night, water running, appliances humming. Instead of familiar creaks and hums, the house echoed with heavy bangs, scraping noises across the floor, and footsteps where no one was walking. The children, once excited about their new home, began to grow fearful. Their wide eyes and nervous expressions showed what words couldn't. Each member of the family seemed to experience something different. George later compared it to a 3-ring circus, each person caught in their own act, their own disturbing reality. For George, the most powerful presence was the cold. It seemed to follow him everywhere, seeping into his bones. He became obsessed with the fireplace, constantly stacking and lighting logs, trying to chase away the chill. But no matter how strong the fire burned, he never felt warm. His focus on chopping wood and feeding the flames soon became more than a chore. It was almost an obsession. The disturbances escalated. One room would suddenly feel suffocatingly hot, while another dropped to freezing cold without reason. These changes left the family unsettled, confused, and increasingly afraid of the very home they had hoped would bring them peace. A sickly sweet odor would drift through the rooms, like the faint scent of old perfume. It came and went without reason. Black stains appeared on bathroom fixtures. No matter how often the Lutz family scrubbed them away, they always returned. And in the heart of winter, when no insects should have survived, the family found themselves battling a sudden swarm of flies. When the Lutzes first toured the home, not a single fly had been in sight. But after moving in, the insects gathered again and again in one particular spot, the sewing room on the 2nd floor. It was the very room Father Ray had once warned them not to use. No matter the season, no matter the temperature, the flies multiplied there. The family could never explain why. Then came a discovery that left George Lutz shaken. One afternoon, while in the basement, he noticed a shelving unit pushed against the wall. Curious, he moved it aside. Behind it, hidden from view, was a small enclosed space. The walls inside were painted entirely red. The air carried a heavy, foul odor. The space wasn't large enough to be called a real room, but it gave off an ominous feeling. The family later learned that this red room did not appear on the original blueprints of the house. Its purpose, and the reason it was concealed, remained a mystery. As weeks passed, unease turned into fear. Night after night, George Lutz would wake suddenly at exactly 3:15 a.m. the same time the DeFeo murders had taken place inside the home. At the same hour, Kathy began experiencing vivid nightmares. In her dreams, she seemed to relive the killings, describing where bullets had entered and exited the victims' bodies. George also began noticing a disturbing pattern in his family's behavior. Kathy and the children, who had never slept on their stomachs before, now rested in that exact position, the same way the DeFeo victims were found. The most unsettling changes appeared in the children, especially 5-year-old Missy. She began speaking about a new imaginary friend named Jody. Jody, she said, was a pig-like figure. It could be large or small. Sometimes it was visible, sometimes invisible. To Missy, it was real. Late at night, George often returned from the boathouse to see glowing eyes staring down from Missy's bedroom window. Each time he rushed upstairs, the room would be empty. Other times, Kathy would walk in to find Missy quietly talking to no one, while the rocking chair across the room swayed back and forth as if someone had just stood up from it. By early January of 1976, the disturbances inside the Lutz home had grown relentless. The family was exhausted, frightened, and desperate for answers. A close friend offered them a suggestion: open every window in the house. Walk from room to room, recite the Lord's Prayer aloud. Maybe, just maybe, this act of faith would drive out whatever was tormenting them. Clinging to hope, the Lutzes followed the advice. One by one, they opened the windows. Together, they prayed as they moved through the halls, but instead of peace, they were met with something disturbing. A chorus of voices, disembodied, angry, and unmistakably real, shouted back, "Will you stop?" The family believed this defiance had only provoked the presence further. By the time dawn broke, they were too drained to fight, finally collapsing into a restless sleep. But the worst was still ahead. After their failed attempt, George and Kathy turned again to Father Ray, the priest who had first blessed the house. They hoped he might return, or at least guide them through what was happening. But every time George tried to call him, something strange occurred. The line filled with static, voices were drowned in a harsh crackle. Then, without warning, the connection would cut. The family pressed on, still determined to reclaim their home. They tried once more to bless the house themselves. But what followed became the final ordeal, the last night they would ever spend inside 112 Ocean Avenue. On January 14th, 1976, just 28 days after moving in, the Lutz family fled 112 Ocean Avenue. They left behind not only the house, but nearly everything they owned. George and Kathy knew what this decision meant. Walking away from the home would bring crushing financial loss. Still, they returned the property to the bank and put their belongings up for auction. George Lutz wasn't ready to let go of the strange events that had driven his family from their home. Determined to find answers, he reached out to a man named Stephen Kaplan. Kaplan was no stranger to the unusual. He was an American paranormal investigator, an author, and a radio commentator. He had even founded the Parapsychology Institute of America, as well as the Vampire Research Center, where he studied everything from hauntings to claims of vampirism. When George contacted him, Kaplan explained exactly how his investigations worked. If the evidence supported claims of supernatural activity, he and his team would share that with the public. If nothing was found, they would say so. And if they uncovered signs of a hoax, they would make that known too. For Kaplan, transparency was key. But only a few days later, George called Kaplan again, this time furious. He was upset over a newspaper article where Kaplan had been quoted saying he would be investigating the Lutz home. George insisted he wanted no publicity. The investigation, he said, would have to wait at least a couple of weeks. Yet, almost immediately, a contradiction appeared. On the very same day George claimed he wanted to avoid attention, he and his wife had already held a press conference of their own earlier that morning. And by evening, George was phoning Kaplan to cancel, citing concerns about unwanted publicity. This raised troubling questions. Why was George publicly speaking to reporters while at the same time telling investigators he wanted to keep things private? Then came a revelation that shocked many. The press conference itself had been arranged not by George or Kathy, but by William Weber, the defense attorney for Butch DeFeo, the man convicted of murdering his family inside that very house. At the time, Weber was working on Butch appeal. And strikingly, he had made contact with George and Kathy almost immediately after they left the home. When Newsday agreed to cover the story, the reporters insisted Weber be present. That detail alone raised suspicion. Why was the lawyer for a convicted killer suddenly linked so closely with the Lutz family? The overlap felt too strange to ignore. The connection became clearer when Paul Hoffman, a freelance writer, approached Weber. Hoffman said the Lutz family wanted to meet with him, and Weber agreed. But Weber had more than just curiosity in mind. He had already been offered an oral commitment for a hefty advance on both a book and a movie deal about the case. At first, Weber kept those commercial plans in the background. Outwardly, he focused on his client. He stressed that Butch DeFeo needed psychological help, and for a while, it appeared that was his true concern. But for George and Kathy Lutz, the meetings carried another meaning. They believed the strange events in their home might have been tied to the same dark forces that once influenced Butch DeFeo. To them, their experiences weren't separate from the past. They were a continuation of something evil that had already left its mark on the house. What truly alarmed people, however, was Weber's growing fixation on money. Weber was discussing contracts, percentages, and film rights with the Lutzes. At one point, he even drafted an agreement that proposed paying Ronald DeFeo himself a share of the profits, around 5%, for the very murders he had committed. For George and Kathy, that was the breaking point. The idea that a convicted killer might profit from their suffering and from the deaths of the DeFeo family was more than they could stomach. They cut ties with William Weber immediately. From that day forward, the unusual alliance between the Lutzes and DeFeo's defense attorney came to an abrupt end. As Weber disappeared from their lives, the deals, the manuscripts, and the promises of Hollywood attention were still out there, waiting. And soon, the line between truth and fiction would blur in ways no one could have predicted. In March of 1976, the house at 112 Ocean Avenue in Amityville, New York, opened its doors once again. But this time, it wasn't a family moving in. It was a team of reporters, a camera crew, and two of the most famous paranormal investigators of the 20th century, Ed and Lorraine Warren. Ed and Lorraine Warren were a married couple who became famous as paranormal investigators in the mid-20th century. Ed Warren was a self-taught demonologist, lecturer, and author. Unlike many in the field, Ed wasn't just a ghost hunter. He focused on cases involving what he believed to be demonic or supernatural forces, while Lorraine Warren claimed to be a clairvoyant and a light trance medium, said to perceive spirits and energies beyond the physical world. Together with Ed, she offered spiritual insight during their investigations. The event was set in motion after the story of George and Kathy Lutz spread across newspapers and television. A young reporter named Laura Didio, working for New York's Channel 5, wanted to follow up on the story. She reached out to the Warrens, who by that time were already known for investigating haunted houses across the country. Alongside her was radio journalist Michael Linder and a team of cameramen and technicians. Their assignment was simple: spend one night inside the Amityville house, document what happened, and broadcast the results. On March 6, 1976, Ed and Lorraine Warren entered the house, accompanied not only by reporters, but also by parapsychologists and psychics. The television crew positioned cameras throughout the house, some set to fire automatically, in hopes of capturing something unusual. Almost immediately, participants claimed the house reacted to their presence. Members of the Channel 5 crew said the atmosphere felt oppressive, heavy with sadness, as if the walls themselves remembered the night of the DeFeo murders. One cameraman suddenly clutched his chest in pain, as if struck by something unseen. Others reported feeling nauseous, weak, or overcome by a strange pressure in their heads. They claimed cold spots appeared without explanation, causing sharp drops in temperature that left investigators shivering. Technical problems also plagued the team. Cameras malfunctioned, audio equipment failed, and batteries drained in minutes. For Lorraine Warren, the experience was especially harrowing. Sensitive to what she described as spiritual energy, She claimed the Amityville house was unlike any other place she had visited. Later, she would recall it as close to hell as she ever wanted to get. During a seance held inside, Lorraine described disturbing visions. She said she saw the bodies of the DeFeo victims laid out under white sheets, while hooded figures stood outside the doorway, silently watching. She insisted that what haunted the home was not only the restless spirits of the murdered family, but something darker, an ancient evil that rose from the ground itself. Other psychics present reported similar impressions. One described entering a room and feeling as though he had walked into hell itself. Another claimed to hear the soft crying of a little girl, while yet another said they saw a child's face in an upstairs window. In the middle of the seance, one participant sprinkled holy water across the room. Witnesses said it made a hissing sound, like water striking a hot surface. Then, without warning, the entire house fell unnaturally silent. Ed Warren himself later claimed he had been physically attacked. While holding a crucifix, he stopped abruptly, describing the sensation of being struck by a powerful force. Despite these claims, reporters noted that they saw no clear evidence of supernatural events. The television footage from that night showed no apparitions, no moving objects, no dramatic displays of haunting. For Channel 5, it was difficult to separate genuine phenomena from fear, imagination, and suggestion. But one piece of evidence emerged that would become legendary. A photographer named Gene Campbell had set up an automatic infrared camera on the second-floor landing. Throughout the night, the camera snapped thousands of frames without human interference. Later, when the film was developed, one image stood out: the unmistakable figure of a small boy peering from a bedroom doorway, his eyes glowing in the light. No children had been present in the house that night. The image circulated widely, fueling belief that the DeFeo children's spirits still roamed the halls. When George and Kathy Lutz's daughter Missy was shown the photograph, she reportedly said, "That's the boy I used to play with there." For every claim of a haunting or ghostly encounter, skeptics pointed to the same point that there was no scientific proof. In the months that followed, the Amityville house was vacated and the Lutz family never returned. Their belongings eventually sold at auction. George and Kathy moved to California, saying they not only needed to escape the house, but also the relentless media attention that came with it. The story, however, was just beginning. In September 1977, the book titled The Amityville Horror was published by a writer named Jay Anson. The first printing of 25,000 copies sold out instantly. The book became a cultural phenomenon, followed by a Hollywood film adaptation in 1979. The book and movie release created a frenzy. Crowds poured into the small town of Amityville from across the United States and even from Europe and swarmed Ocean Avenue. The house in Amityville quickly became more than just a building. Its top-floor windows gave it a face, two shapes that looked like watchful eyes. Many people described the feeling that the house was staring back at them, as if it carried its own dark personality. While thousands of people believed the story was real, others began to question it and suspected that it might all be a hoax. Later in 1979, William Weber gave an interview that shocked everyone following the Amityville story. He admitted that he and George and Kathy Lutz had sat together over several bottles of wine and created the horror story together. William Weber explained that during these long conversations, they added frightening details piece by piece: moving walls, ghostly figures, demonic voices. None of it, he said, came from fact. It was a story designed to terrify and, most importantly, to sell. This was not just a lawyer making an offhand remark. William Weber was the man closest to the DeFeo case. His words gave weight to the idea that the Amityville Horror, one of the most famous hauntings in American history, may have been a carefully constructed hoax. William Weber openly stated in interviews that the entire haunting had been invented during those meetings with the Lutzes. The quote most often repeated is blunt: "I know this book is a hoax. We created this horror story over many bottles of wine." Here was an insider, someone tied both to the original murders and to the Lutz's version of events, saying outright that the haunting was manufactured. When books and film deals started to emerge, William Weber claimed he was cut out of the profits. In response, lawsuits flew back and forth. The Lutzes accused William Weber of exploiting their story, while Weber accused them of betrayal. The courts became yet another stage for the Amityville drama. Judges dismissed parts of the lawsuits, while some were settled out of court. The credibility of the Lutzes was already under attack, and William Weber's confession made it worse. Journalists and investigators also corroborated William Weber's admission and pointed out contradictions in the Lutzes' accounts. For example, researchers later found more than 100 mistakes and contradictions in the book, errors that cast doubt on what had really happened inside the house. One of the most famous details was a drawing by Lutz's young daughter, Missy. She claimed her imaginary friend, a creature called Jody, often appeared at her bedroom window, watching her with glowing red eyes. But when neighbors were shown the picture, they had a different explanation. They said it looked just like the family's Persian cat. The DeFeo had nicknamed the cat the pig because of its size. Even the mysterious flies that the Lutzes reported had a simpler answer. Investigators noted that after the murders, the house had been closed for days with the heat still on inside. Under those conditions, it wouldn't take much imagination to understand why insects appeared in such numbers. After the Lutz family left, the house was sold to Jim and Barbara Cromartie. When asked about the condition of the home, they explained that it was in excellent shape. Despite the stories of violent paranormal activity, the Cromarties said there was nothing damaged and no repairs were needed when they moved in. Skeptics also began to question some of the Lutz family's claims. For example, George Lutz once said that a window had slammed shut on his son's hand, sending them to the hospital for treatment. But when pressed for records, George admitted they had never gone to the hospital at all and had only bandaged the injury at home. Still, confusion surrounded the story. For some, these explanations proved that the haunting was a hoax. For others, the confusion itself was a sign of evil, something beyond human understanding. Journalists and researchers dug deeper, comparing the book's claims with the facts. They confronted Jay Anson with evidence that many details in the book were false. He brushed it aside. He admitted openly that his real goal was not to report the truth, but to write a best-selling book. When you add these contradictions and errors to attorney William Weber's admission, the skeptical case becomes powerful. The Amityville horror might not really be a haunting, but rather a business arrangement that turned into a cultural phenomenon. Between 1974 and his death in 2021, Ronald Butch DeFeo changed his story again and again about what really happened inside the Amityville house. Decades after the murders, Ronald DeFeo Jr. would reveal something unsettling. He told psychic Jackie Barrett that on the night of the killings, he had deliberately turned up the thermostat. His goal, he said, was to throw off the medical examiner, so the time of death wouldn't be accurate. The medical examiner originally believed the family died around 3:15 a.m., but according to Butch, the murders actually took place closer to 1:15 a.m. Jackie Barrett later documented these conversations in her 2012 book, The Devil I Know. But one thing has never made sense. How could 6 people be killed in their beds without at least 5 of them escaping after the first shotgun blast? The weapon used that night was a rifle. It had no silencer. Butch later claimed he had drugged his family with sedatives so they couldn't move. But the autopsy reports told a very different story. The medical examiner explained they did extensive toxicology, not only on the blood and urine, but on every organ. There wasn't anything in their bodies. Then came another disturbing discovery. When Dawn's body was examined, unburned gunpowder was found on the front of her nightgown. What could this mean? Some experts believe it happened at the moment of her death. Butch may have been standing so close when he fired that the gunpowder transferred from the rifle to her clothes. That's a reasonable explanation, but it also raises a troubling question. If Dawn was found lying face down on her stomach, how did the gunpowder end up on the front of her nightgown? That detail has fueled one of the most controversial theories of all, that Butch may not have acted alone. Could Dawn have fired the rifle herself, killing their mother and siblings before Butch turned the gun on her? The second bullet removed from Louise DeFeo's body didn't match Butch's rifle. Butch had already directed police to a pillowcase stuffed with clothing, rifle cartridges, and holsters for both the rifle and a handgun. But this raised a troubling question. If Butch only used the rifle, why get rid of a handgun holster? That small detail set filmmaker Ryan Katzenbach down a new path years later. To him, it hinted at something missing, perhaps even a second weapon. He wondered if a handgun could still be lying at the bottom of the water near the DeFeo boathouse, close to where police had already found a second bloody pillowcase in a garbage can. In 2012, Katzenbach hired divers to test his theory. After hours of searching, they recovered part of what appeared to be a handgun. The piece was carefully turned over to the Suffolk County Police Crime Lab. The original story claimed the DeFeo family had been asleep when they were killed, but evidence suggested otherwise. Take the case of Mark DeFeo. Like the others, his body was found face down, lying flat on his stomach. But Mark had been injured in a football accident. He used a wheelchair and could only sleep on his back. So how did he end up face down? Was he forced into that position after death? Shockingly, the medical examiner supported parts of this theory, stating that the idea of multiple shooters was not impossible. Even the prosecutor admitted during trial that Butch may have had an accomplice. So who could that accomplice have been? Butch himself never stopped pointing to his sister Dawn. In 1986, Butch sat down for an interview with Newsday. Once again, he claimed Dawn was the shooter. And once again, he explained why he hadn't said this from the beginning. He admitted he was terrified of his great-uncle, the mobster Pete DeFeo, and of his grandfather, Mike Brigante. He believed they would have killed him if he blamed Dawn. Butch also told Newsday something startling. At the time of the murders, he claimed he was married and had a young daughter. He said he should have been at home in New Jersey with his wife, Geraldine, that night. But according to him, Louise DeFeo had called, asking him to come to Amityville to break up a fight between Dawn and his father. And soon, deeper questions arose. Was Butch even married at the time? Geraldine later told author Rick Osuna that she and Butch had married in 1970 and that their daughter was born in 1974. But official records tell a different story. Their divorce documents, filed in 1993, stated the two didn't even meet till 1985 and that they married in 1989. So which version was true? In Osuna's book, The Night the DeFeos Died, Geraldine offered her explanation. She claimed the contradictions were intentional. With her family tied to the Lombardi crime family, she said she was told to disappear when police began looking into the possibility of a female accomplice. According to her, Butch's uncle Pete DeFeo and her own relatives worked together to erase their original marriage certificate. To protect her and the children, they staged a second marriage ceremony in 1989. For Geraldine, it was a matter of survival. Geraldine would hold on to her story until her death in 2015. In 1990, Ronald Butch DeFeo filed what's called a 440 motion. It's a legal request asking the court to overturn a conviction, usually on the grounds that the defendant didn't receive proper legal representation. In Butch's case, that motion brought back one of the most infamous claims he had ever made, the claim that voices told him to murder his family. Butch said that on the night of the murders, he had fallen asleep on the couch in the basement while watching a war movie. When he woke up, the lights and television were off. Then, he claimed, he heard his family whispering, talking as if they were plotting against him. According to Butch, a figure then appeared. He described a woman with black hands holding a rifle. She came into the room and kicked him. He thought it was his sister, Dawn. When Butch was trying to support his 440 motion, his story had changed again. He added something new. He spoke of a mysterious gunman, a second shooter who he claimed killed his mother and father before fleeing the house. Butch insisted he didn't get a good look at the person. He also said his wife's brother was present that night and could back up his story. But the judge ultimately denied his 440 motion. Still, Butch never gave up trying to shift the blame. At his parole hearing in 1999, Ronald Butch DeFeo told a story that sounded very different from the one the public had heard for years. He said he had been in the basement with a friend when he heard a muffled sound, something like a gunshot. He rushed upstairs. On the second floor, he found his sister Allison dead in her bed. From there, he climbed to the third floor and entered his sister Dawn's room. According to Butch, Dawn looked at him with shock and said, "Oh my God, but you're not supposed to be here." Then, he claimed, Dawn grabbed the rifle, aimed it at him, and before she could pull the trigger, he wrestled it away and shot her. Butch insisted to the parole board that he didn't know who had shot his parents. He also claimed he had only heard that single gunshot before killing Dawn. A year later, in 2000, Butch shared even more details in a letter he wrote to author Rick Osuna. In it, he expanded on the story he gave the board. In this new version, Butch said that he, Dawn, and two friends had been getting high in the basement the night of the murders. There, they hatched a plan to finally put an end to their abusive father. Around 1 a.m., they carried it out. Butch explained that one of his friends was armed with a .38 Colt Python revolver, while he and Dawn carried the rifle. The other friend stood watch. Together, they went to the parents' room. Butch said he shot his father first, but when the first bullet didn't kill him, he fired again as his father tried to get up. Then, Butch claimed, he shot his mother once. After that, his friend delivered a second shot, the one that actually killed her. This, he said, would explain why investigators found bullets from two different guns inside Louise DeFeo's body. But according to Butch, the most shocking part came next. He claimed that Dawn turned the rifle on her younger brothers and sister, killing them so there would be no witnesses left behind. Butch said he had left the house briefly to chase after one of the friends, who panicked and ran when the shooting began. When he returned, he was enraged to discover what Dawn had done. In his fury, he knocked her onto the bed and shot her dead. In Butch's own words, written directly to Osuna, there was no mystery. It was cold-blooded murder, period. No ghosts, no demons, just three people, and I was one. It was a blunt statement, one that stripped away the supernatural legends that made the Amityville case famous. But at the same time, it raised more questions than it answered. On Friday, March 12, 2021, Ronald Butch DeFeo Jr. died in prison. He was 69 years old. He had spent 47 years behind bars. The DeFeo case shocked America. But what happens when a millionaire in England turns his own home into a crime scene? You can tap on the screen to watch and make sure to subscribe and hit the bell icon so you never miss an update. Thank you for watching. See you on the next one.